My husband was dying in the ER. I was 3,000 miles away in London. I called my son and said one word, please. He told me his wife's birthday mattered more. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I called my lawyer instead and said one sentence that changed everything. A few days later, my son called me, and what he said left me speechless. I am 60 years old and I have learned that you can love someone for 32 years, raise him with everything you had, and still discover, in a single phone call, that he has become a stranger wearing your son's voice. My name is Beverly Okafor. My husband Desmond and I have been married for 34 years. 15 years ago, a stroke left him partially paralyzed on his left side and dependent, in various ways, on daily care. Not helpless, never that. Desmond has never once let his condition define the fullness of who he is. But genuinely loyal, but genuinely vulnerable in a way that requires vigilance, medication schedules, and a support system that can respond quickly when something goes wrong. I have built my entire life around that vigilance for a decade and a half, gladly. I called my lawyer instead, because that is what love looks like, when the person you married needs you in a different way than either of you ever imagined on your wedding day. We have one son, Patrick, 30 years old, and for most of his life. I believed I had raised a good man. Attentive as a boy, protective of his father even as a teenager, the kind of son who used to sit beside Desmond's wheelchair after school just to talk about nothing in particular, because he understood. Even at 15, that presence itself was a kind of medicine. Patrick married a woman named Simone 4 years ago, sharp, ambitious, the kind of woman who has always made clear, in small ways I noticed but rarely commented on, that she found our family's particular rhythms, the medical schedules, the caution, the slower pace that Desmond's condition sometimes required, somewhat exhausting to accommodate. I had travelled to London 10 days before the night this story truly begins. For a reason that felt, at the time, entirely justified, my younger sister, Adazay, had been diagnosed with early-stage lymphoma. I called my lawyer instead, and she'd asked me to be there for her first 2 rounds of treatment, a request I could not in good conscience refuse, not after everything she had done for our family during Desmond's own recovery years earlier. I had arranged extensive care coverage for Desmond before I left, a rotating schedule of home health aides, a check-in system with our family doctor, and crucially, an explicit understanding with Patrick that he would be my primary point of contact and backup support if anything urgent arose while I was overseas, given that he lived only 20 minutes from his father. Considerably closer than any other family member, the call came at 2 a.m. London time, which meant 9 p.m. back home on the 8th night of my stay. It was Desmond's home health aide, a steady, competent woman named Rita, who had cared for him for nearly 3 years, her voice carrying a controlled urgency that told me immediately this was serious. Mrs. Okafor, I'm so sorry to call so late. But Mr. Okafor started having severe chest pain and difficulty breathing about 20 minutes ago. I called the ambulance immediately. We're at Riverside Memorial now. They're running tests, but I wanted you to know right away. I sat up in my sister's guest bed, my heart pounding, my mind already racing through flight schedules and time zones and every terrible possibility a stroke survivor's chest pain might represent. Is he conscious? Is he stable? He's conscious. He's talking, but they're taking it very seriously, given his history. I think you should know what's happening, and I think it would help if someone from the family could be here with him tonight, even if it's not you. I know you're overseas. I thanked her, told her I would call back within minutes, and immediately called Patrick, my hands shaking as I dialed. He answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear musicians' voices in the background, laughter, the unmistakable sound of a party in full swing. Mom, what's up? Is everything okay? Patrick? I said, my voice already breaking slightly despite every effort to stay composed. Your father's in the ER, Riverside Memorial. He's having chest pain. They're running tests. Rita's with him, but I need you to go. Please, right now. He shouldn't be alone tonight. There was a pause on the line, and in the background I heard Simone's voice, bright and celebratory, calling out something I couldn't fully make out, followed by a chorus of laughter. Mom, Patrick said, and something in his voice had already shifted, become guarded, defensive before I'd even asked anything more of him. It's Simone's birthday. We're at her sister's place. There's like 30 people here. I can't just leave in the middle of this. Patrick, your father is in the emergency room. He had a stroke 15 years ago. Chest pain at his age with his history. is not something to take lightly. I am 3,000 miles away. I need you to go. Mom, I'm sure he's fine. Rita's literally a nurse's aide. She knows what she's doing. They're at the hospital. What exactly would me showing up right this second actually change? It would mean he's not alone, Patrick. It would mean his son is there. I heard him sigh, heard him half turn away from the phone to say something to someone else. And then his voice came back. Colder now, more final than anything he had ever said to me in 30 years of being my son. Mom, I love Dad, you know I do, but my wife is celebrating her birthday right now, and that's what matters tonight. I'll check in on him tomorrow. I'm sure Rita's got it handled. I gotta go, Mom. Everyone's waiting for the cake. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat in my sister's guest room, phone still in my hand, staring at the wall. Feeling something inside me crack in a way that had nothing to do with the immediate fear for Desmond's physical safety, and everything to do with a much older, quieter fear I had apparently been carrying, unexamined, for longer than I wanted to admit. The fear that somewhere along the way, the son I had raised to understand presence as a form of love had become a man who genuinely believed a birthday cake outweighed his father's emergency room visit. I called Rita back, arranged for her to stay with Desmond through the night on an emergency overtime basis that I would happily pay whatever it cost, and then I sat awake in that guest bedroom until dawn. I called my lawyer, doing the only thing I actually could do from 3,000 miles away, waiting and thinking with a clarity that only fully frightening nights seemed to produce, about exactly what kind of family I had actually built. Desmond was, thankfully, stabilized by morning. West pain, the chest pain, turned out to be a serious but treatable cardiac event, not the more catastrophic possibility I had feared through the night, requiring a new medication regimen and close monitoring, but not ultimately. I called my lawyer, the kind of emergency that would end his life that particular evening. I cried with relief when Rita called with the news at 6 a.m. London time, and then, almost immediately afterward, I felt a different kind of emotion settle over the relief, a cold. I called my lawyer instead, clear-eyed anger that had nothing to do with the medical outcome and everything to do with the specific words my son had chosen to say to me, while his father sat in an emergency room bed. I called my lawyer instead. I finished my sister's second tricycle over the following 2 days, unable in good conscience to abandon her either, and flew home on the earliest flight I could arrange after that, landing back in the city 10 days after I'd left it. Carrying with me a decision that had crystallized somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, watching the dark water below and thinking, with a steadiness that surprised even me, about exactly what needed to happen next. I did not go home first. I want to be honest about the order of events, because I think it matters for understanding the state of mind I was in. I went directly from the airport to my longtime attorney's office, a careful, thorough woman named Andrea Bramwell, who had handled Desmond's and my estate planning for over a decade, ever since his stroke had first made us confront, seriously and specifically, what would happen to our affairs if either of us became incapacitated or passed away. Andrea had known our family for years. She had drafted the trust that protected Desmond's care needs, the healthcare directives, the will that had, for the entirety of Patrick's adult life, treated him as our sole heir, and more relevantly to what was about to happen. The designated healthcare proxy, who would make medical decisions on Desmond's behalf if I were ever unavailable or unable to do so myself. I sat across from her desk, exhausted from travel, still carrying the particular hollow ache of a sleepless transatlantic flight, and told her everything. The call from Rita, the call to Patrick, the party in the background, the specific words my son had chosen. My wife is celebrating her birthday. That's all that matters. Andrea listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished, she asked me the question I had been waiting, in some sense, for someone to ask me directly. Beverly, what do you want to do? I thought about this question more carefully than almost any other question I've been asked in my adult life. I did not want to act purely out of the raw, exhausted anger of that sleepless night on the phone, with my sister's guest room wallpaper staring back at me. I wanted my decision to reflect something true and considered, not simply the wound of a single terrible phone call, however deeply it had cut. I want Patrick removed as Desmond's healthcare proxy, I finally said. Effective immediately. Andrea nodded slowly, making a note. That's a significant decision, Beverly. I want to make sure you're certain before we draft the paperwork. Removing him as proxy means that if something happens to you, and Desmond needs a medical decision made on his behalf and can't communicate his own wishes, Patrick would have no legal authority in that moment. Who would you designate instead? I had already thought about this during the long flight home. My sister Adaze, I said, once her treatment is finished. She sat with me through 15 years of this, Andrea. She has never once, in all that time, treated Desmond's condition as an inconvenience to be worked around. And the will? Do you want any changes there as well? I sat with that question for a long moment. Some part of me, in the raw anger of that transatlantic flight, had wanted to strip Patrick of everything entirely, to make the consequence as absolute and immediate as the coldness he had shown his own father. But a different, steadier part of me, the part that had spent 30 years genuinely loving the boy Patrick had once been, before whatever had shifted in him over recent years finally fully surfaced, resisted that impulse, at least for the moment. Not yet, I said. I want to see how he responds first, once he understands what's happened. But I need this healthcare proxy change made now, today if possible, because I am never again going to be in a position where my husband's medical decisions rest in the hands of someone who thinks a birthday cake outranks an emergency room visit. Andrea drafted the paperwork that same afternoon, and by early evening, the healthcare proxy documents had been formally updated, removing Patrick entirely and, on a temporary basis until Adaze's own health situation stabilized, naming Andrea's own firm as an interim medical decision-maker, a standard legal arrangement for exactly this kind of transitional situation. I want to explain something about why I chose to say only one sentence to Andrea that day, rather than a longer explanation, because I think it matters for understanding my state of mind in that meeting. The sentence I actually said, verbatim, sitting across from her desk after recounting everything that had happened, was this: I need my son removed as Desmond's healthcare proxy today, because he has shown me he cannot be trusted to put his father's life ahead of his own convenience. That single sentence carried within it 30 years of accumulated love, a decade and a half of watching a marriage transform under the weight of disability and devotion, and one specific, devastating phone call that had finally crystallized, something I think I had been quietly avoiding understanding for longer than I wanted to admit. I went home that evening to Desmond, still recovering in the hospital, sat beside his bed, and told him everything: the call, Patrick's words, the decision I'd made with Andrea that afternoon. Desmond, who has always possessed a steadiness and grace under difficult circumstances that I have admired for our entire marriage, listened quietly, his good hand finding mine on the hospital blanket. I'm not surprised, he said finally, and something in his voice carried a sadness that told me he, too, had perhaps been quietly noticing something shifting in our son for longer than either of us had wanted to name aloud. I felt it for a while, Bev. Small things, the way he stopped asking about my appointments the way he used to. The way Simone always seems to have somewhere more important to be whenever we need anything from them. I think I've been telling myself it was nothing, the same way you probably have. What do we do now? I asked.
I think,
Desmond said slowly. We let him understand exactly what his choice cost him, not out of cruelty, out of honesty. He needs to understand that love isn't just a feeling you carry around, it's what you actually choose to do when it's inconvenient to choose it. I did not call Patrick that evening, or the following day, or the day after that. I wanted him to discover the change in his own time, through his own channels, rather than receiving it filtered through my anger in a phone call. I knew, given the nature of medical paperwork and hospital systems, that it would not take long for him to notice. The discovery happened as I expected, 4 days after I'd made the change with Andrea. Patrick called me on a Thursday evening, his voice carrying a confusion that had not yet fully hardened into the defensiveness I anticipated would eventually surface. Mom, I went to check on Dad's discharge paperwork today, and the hospital told me I'm not listed as his healthcare contact anymore. What's going on? Did something happen with the account? Is this a mistake? It's not a mistake, Patrick, I said, keeping my voice level. The same steadiness I had cultivated over that long, sleepless flight home. I made the change with Andrea 4 days ago. There was a long silence on the line. Why would you do that without telling me? I'm telling you now, I said. I made the change
because when your father was in the emergency room, frightened, in pain, uncertain whether he was having a heart attack, I called you and asked you to go to him, and you told me that Simone's birthday mattered more. I need to know that if something happens to me, and your father needs someone to make a medical decision on his behalf, that person will actually prioritize his life over their own convenience. You showed me, very clearly, that you're not currently that person. Mom, that's not fair. It was one night. I told you Rita was handling it, and she was, right? He was fine, because his condition this time wasn't as severe as it could have been. That's not the same as you making the right choice, Patrick. You had no way of knowing, in that moment, how serious it actually was. You chose not to go anyway, because a party felt more important than the possibility that your father might be dying. So what? I'm being punished for one bad night. People make mistakes, Mom. That's not the same as being some kind of terrible son. I'm not punishing you, I said, and I meant this as honestly as I've ever meant anything. I'm protecting your father. There's a difference. This isn't about revenge, Patrick. It's about making sure the people responsible for his care, in the moments it matters most, are people who will actually show up. He was quiet for a long moment. Is this permanent? I don't know yet, I said honestly. That depends, I think, on what happens next. On whether this was a single terrible lapse in judgment, born out of exhaustion or distraction or simply bad timing, or whether it reflects something that has actually changed in how you see your responsibilities to this family. I did not hear from him again for 3 days after that call. And I want to be honest that those 3 days were among the hardest of the entire ordeal for me. Harder, in some ways, than the original phone call itself. Because they forced me to sit with genuine uncertainty about whether my son would rise to meet this moment or retreat further into the defensiveness I had heard building in his voice. He called again on a Sunday evening, and something in his voice, from the very first word, told me this call was different from the one 4 days earlier. Mom, he said, can I come see you and Dad? I want to talk in person, not over the phone. He arrived the following afternoon, alone. A detail I noticed immediately, given that Simone had accompanied him to nearly every family visit over the preceding 2 years. He sat across from Desmond and me at our kitchen table, the same table where he had done his childhood homework, where we had celebrated 100 ordinary family dinners over 3 decades, and he was quiet for a long moment before he finally spoke. I've been thinking a lot since your call, he said, his voice unsteady in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager. About that night, and honestly, about a lot of things that led up to it that I don't think I've been fully honest with myself about. What do you mean? I asked. Simone's been. He paused, choosing his words carefully. She's made it clear in a lot of small ways over the past couple years that she finds our family's stuff, Dad's care stuff, kind of a lot. Inconvenient, I guess, is the word she'd use, though she'd never say it that directly. And I think I've been quietly absorbing that attitude more than I realized, letting it shape how I show up for you both, without ever really examining it honestly. That night, when you called, and I heard you say Dad might be dying, some part of me knew immediately I needed to go, and I chose not to, because some other part of me had already decided, somewhere along the way, that keeping Simone happy mattered more than showing up for you and Dad in the moment it actually counted. That's not something I'm proud to say out loud, but I think it's true, and I think you deserve the honesty. Desmond, who had been listening quietly, spoke for the first time. Son, I need you to understand something. I don't need you to be perfect. I've needed help with things most people never have to think about for 15 years now, and I understand. In a way, maybe only your mother fully understands too, how heavy that can feel for the people around me sometimes. But there's a difference between struggling with the weight of it honestly and telling your mother, in the middle of an emergency, that a birthday party matters more than whether I'm dying. That sentence, Patrick, I don't think you understand what it did to your mother. Standing in a guest bedroom 3,000 miles away, unable to do anything but wait. Patrick's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I had seen from him since this entire ordeal began. I know, he said. I've thought about that phone call every single day since. I keep hearing myself say it. And I don't even fully recognize the person who said it. I don't know when I became someone who would say that to my own mother. We talked for nearly 3 hours that afternoon, a conversation more honest than any we had had in years, about Simone's growing resentment of the time and attention Desmond's care required, about Patrick's own quiet complicity in letting that resentment shape his choices without ever confronting it directly, about the specific, painful gap between the boy who used to sit beside his father's wheelchair after school and the man who had, somewhere along the way, allowed a birthday cake to outweigh his father's emergency room visit. I did not restore his healthcare proxy status that day. I told him, honestly, that trust of that magnitude would need to be rebuilt over time, through consistent action rather than a single difficult conversation, however genuine it felt in the moment. He accepted this without argument, which itself told me something important about the sincerity of what he'd said.
It has been 18 months now since that night in London, and I want to tell this part of the story honestly, because I think a story like this deserves an honest ending rather than a perfectly tidy one. Patrick separated from Simone 4 months after that difficult conversation at our kitchen table, a decision, he told me, with a clarity that genuinely surprised me, came from finally examining honestly how much of his own values he had allowed to bend around her discomfort with our family's realities. I do not know every detail of what led to their separation, and I have deliberately not pried further than Patrick has volunteered, out of respect for the fact that this remains, in the end, his own difficult chapter to process. Since then, Patrick has shown up for his father consistently, in ways both small and significant. Sunday dinners he no longer treats as negotiable around someone else's preferences. Doctor's appointments he now attends without being asked, a genuine, rebuilt attentiveness that reminds me, more and more each month, of the boy who used to sit beside Desmond's wheelchair simply to keep him company. I restored his healthcare proxy status 11 months after the original change, once I had watched, over nearly a year, a sustained pattern of genuine presence rather than a single performative gesture of contrition. Andrea helped me draft the updated paperwork, and I remember signing those documents, a complicated mixture of relief and lingering caution. Relief that my son had done the hard work of actually changing. Caution from the specific memory of a phone call I do not think I will ever fully stop hearing in my mind when I think about that night in London. Desmond's health has remained stable since that frightening evening. The new medication regimen working well, his good humour and steadiness as intact as ever despite everything our family has weathered together over the preceding year and a half. He and Patrick have, in their own quiet way, rebuilt something between them that I believe is more honest now than it was even before this entire ordeal began. A relationship built on Patrick's actual, demonstrated choices rather than an assumption of loyalty that had, apparently, been quietly eroding for longer than either Desmond or I had wanted to admit. I am 60 years old. I have spent 15 years learning what genuine devotion looks like in the specific, unglamorous daily work of caring for someone I love through disability and vulnerability, and I spent one devastating phone call, 3,000 miles from home, learning exactly how thin that same devotion can become in someone who has quietly let convenience reshape his own values without ever confronting it honestly. People sometimes ask me if I regret the one sentence I said to Andrea Bramwell that day, sitting exhausted in her office after a transatlantic flight, asking her to remove my own son as his father's healthcare proxy. I tell them the truth. I do not regret it for a single moment. That sentence was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of protection, for Desmond, for the 15 years of devotion I had built our entire life around, and in the end, though I could not have known it at the time, for the version of my son who was still, somewhere underneath the coldness of that one terrible phone call, capable of becoming someone worth trusting again, Patrick called me. 4 days after that decision, confused and defensive at first, and then 3 days after that called again, this time asking to come see us in person. Ready finally to sit across from his parents and confront honestly what he had allowed himself to become. That second call, the one where he finally chose honesty over defensiveness, is the one I hold on to now. More than the coldness of the first. It is proof, I believe, that love, even when it falters badly, is sometimes still capable of finding its way back home, provided someone is willing to hold the line long enough, honestly enough, to give it the chance to do so.